Okay, thank you to our panelists. We have about 15 minutes left for discussion and a number of questions that have been emerging here. I'm going to jump right in here and say there's a clear kind of opportunity or synergy between the kind of data that the wearable sensors can provide and how it might impact the models that we saw both from Pinar and Natasha. So I'd just like Pinar and Natasha to just reflect a little bit about if there was a small set of pieces of information about an individual, what do you think would be the most impactful in the modeling efforts that you've been doing?
Thanks. I totally agree. We've been thinking about this as a potentially really hugely valuable source of information. At the moment, we are using just self-reported symptom screens in order to encourage people to get tested, as well as our kind of routine ongoing asymptomatic testing program. Where I think that this could be really valuable is if people were in these wearable sensors, it could give us a signal prior to when they even registered and noticed it themselves that there was something wrong, and then use that as the kind of a way to encourage that person to go get tested, and therefore help us, detect COVID early. One of the really tricky things about COVID infection is that individuals are infectious prior to the development of the clinical symptoms, But these technologies may be able to detect it in that stage where not only are they transmissible, but it's one of the highest transmissibility periods, that sort of just prior to onset of clinically observable symptoms. So being able to detect individuals earlier in their time course of infection, potentially through using these wearable sensors, would be fantastic.
Pinar?
So most of the models, they kind of look at the population or subpopulation level. I think some of these sensors could really help us take action at the individual level. As both Natasha and I mentioned, people go through these different stages differently. The impact is different, the duration is different. Some people may have no symptoms and yet they may be infectious. Many of these things we don't know in detail. If we knew a little bit more specifically for this person, they are quite infectious right now, and then they really need to be careful about even staying away from their family members or household members. Those types of information could really help us take some of the activities or recommendations from the one-size-fits-all public level to a more smaller group or individual level. Because if you think about it, many of these interventions may look like they create disruption in the way we know life. And having more detailed information could not only help us better understand the progression in the individual, but also be able to take action at a more smaller, detailed individual level rather than this one-size-fits-all.
So now, John, I want to ask a question that a lot of people are kind of directing towards you. It's clear that there's opportunity for the kind of data you're collecting to inform the models that we've heard about. And so some of the questions to you are, these technologies that you've developed, how far away are they from being available to others to use? Maybe not necessarily commercially available, but are they, are we near these being available to people? And how long might you use one of these devices and collect data in a reliable manner?
Yeah, great question, Greg. I mean, I think as a biomedical engineer, your goal ultimately is wide-scale deployment, right? You'd like to have a broader societal impact, and we're very much interested in that as a goal. We have a couple of startups in place. Everything I shared with you today is really coming out of my academic group. We have some low-volume manufacturing capability in my lab, and so we can crank out kind of a few hundreds of these devices, but we designed them up front to be well aligned with established manufacturing capabilities that support the consumer electronics industry. So I don't think there's any intrinsic challenge in scale up. There's no cost impediment, I think, for deployment, at least in most places on the globe. We do have advanced commercial deployments of related devices, similar form factor, slightly different sets of measurement functionality, really focused on vital signs measurements, maternal, fetal, neonatal, pediatric health. We have funding from the Gates Foundation, so we're deployed at scale right now in Kenya, Zambia, Ghana, will be in India and Pakistan by the end of the year. I think 7,000 devices so far. Will touch probably 50,000 lives within the next 12 months. For these suprasternal notch devices, kind of tailored for COVID, we'll be doing a deployment funded by the DoD into certain segments of the military later this fall, a few thousand devices. And we have a large deal with the third largest medical insurer here in the U.S. And the current schedule is to deploy devices onto 300,000 people by middle of 2021. We'll see how that plays out. But we're poised to do scale deployments, and we're excited about that. I think everything is lined up. The interesting thing is cough and cough counting and measuring the sounds of coughs and intensity and cadence and frequency and so on. This is well known to be an important signature of disease, but it's never been measured continuously before. So there's a little bit of a discovery aspect associated with the device. It's not just a matter of engineering, devices and manufacturing them at scale and getting them out there. It's also around the question of how do I interpret the data most effectively? And I think that's what's great about having this opportunity to share some of the things that we're doing with this community, because the kind of machine learning and data analytics expertise that I think is going to be really valuable in this space is a little bit outside of my own core areas of expertise. And at the same time, I think, having that analytics in place is going to be almost as important as the devices themselves. And so I think, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of opportunity there.
Thanks, John. So Natasha and Pinar, you can see in what John's presenting, and a lot of the people in this community, we really strive to get devices that can collect continuously information from a large number of people, of relevant information. But what that means is, compared to the relatively static data and parameters that you've used to feed your models, this would be essentially data that would aggregate and change on a weekly, daily, maybe hourly basis. How would that modify or impact your modeling approach to have that much change in these parameters?
I mean, I would say the more data, the better for these models. They can be adapted easily, incorporating some of those changes. The parameters can be adjusted, and in particular, if we can actually project how some parameters, how some of the input into the model might change, we can incorporate that as well as we are making projections into the future. Just like we do, for example, with the scenarios about interventions. We don't assume that people will comply with the interventions at the same level throughout the next 6 months. We look at the behaviors and patterns from before, and we project how those behaviors might change moving forward, and incorporate it in a way into the model that helps us foresee some of those changes. And then as new data and information becomes available, we would adjust and recalibrate based on the new information. So I would say any additional information, data, or information that's by manipulating the data for the models, that's always very, very much welcome. And one additional thing I'll mention very briefly is to also think beyond people, because like I mentioned very briefly, this panel focuses on COVID, but there are so many diseases where the transmission includes animals as well as the environment. I think some of the techniques and technologies developed by this community could be very, very helpful for those as well.
Can I just add, I mean, I totally agree with all of that. I think in some domains, there is going to be an issue in terms of needing kind of data reduction and identification of what are the key pieces of data that we need to measure in terms of understanding this change. So one of the things we're thinking about right now is we have this proximity data. It's collecting in, information on devices that are in contact with other devices every 5 minutes and pinging that to us. And we're using it to infer, contact networks between individuals. And we have simulations where contact networks can change over time. And we want to use the kind of Bluetooth bumped data to help us parameterize that. But there is a question about, how much of that data do we need? Do we need it between all devices, cell phones and computers and, whatever Apple Watch you're wearing, right? trying to understand and kind of reduce that data set to understand what are the key features and key pieces of data that we need that have the most effect on COVID transmission is really kind of a really important first step. And then we can feed those key features to, into the model and have those things change over time. But I think there is space for trying to understand that and do that in a sophisticated way.
All right, so I'm going to wrap up this panel. And first with an apology. Our general chairs thought we should have made this session 90 minutes, and I said no, 60 minutes would be enough, and they were right. I was wrong. I apologize. You can tell by all the questions that are in the Q&A right now. But I want to end giving each of you about 45 seconds or so. I want you to reflect on what your experience has been as researchers who do things that are related to COVID, but you weren't planning to do something like this until maybe 7 or 8 months ago. And you know, at this point, how do you reflect on how it's impacted you as a researcher, and just give some general advice to, we had a lot of students here, about how you take your research and pivot it toward meaningful and pressing problems. Why don't we start with John?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think we were thrilled to have an opportunity to contribute in some way, and I don't want to sort of overstate what we've been able to do, but you know, we have a certain set of competencies, and we got some requests from downtown, and you know, we're happy to engage. And I think the students responded very effectively, very energetically, and forcefully, right, urgently to those requests. And so I think it was kind of a great experience for us, and hopefully we've done something that's helpful, maybe not just for this pandemic episode. We'll eventually get through it, but setting the foundations for things that are likely valuable going forward. I think one of the consequences of this episode is that it's really heightened the awareness of the value of telemedicine and remote monitoring. And I think that's going to be a real sea change in the way that people think about how to effectively and efficiently deliver care to patients, and how to improve outcomes and reduce costs. And so so it's been a very engaging and rewarding experience. But I think the other thing is, working with these frontline healthcare workers, it really inspires us. I mean, what they're doing, and the fact that they're putting their lives at risk to help people, it's really humbling to see that, and to contribute in some way. It's great, but those are real heroes in my view.
Thank you, John. Natasha?
Yeah, I would say it's overwhelming, but also incredibly inspiring. I think even just speaking at this conference today exemplifies how far we've come in the last few months, really everybody coming together across multiple disciplines who are working on totally different things, trying to figure out, what they can add, how they can work together to respond to COVID. It's put me in contact with people and disciplines and thinking about ways that we might integrate data that I've never experienced, but it's where we should be as a field. And I feel like actually in a way, COVID's a great way that has brought people together and facilitated open collaboration because of the urgency. People have reached out and the willingness to collaborate even when things aren't perfect and it hasn't been peer reviewed necessarily, and just kind of putting it out there and trying to make things better has been so exciting and really inspirational in general for my research.
Thank you. Pinar?
So my team has done quite a bit of work in infectious disease modeling in the past, including pandemic flu. So in that sense, the modeling aspect, starting on COVID, was a natural transition. But I would say at a much more tightened time scale that we academics are not always used to. Everything kind of moves very fast. And also working very, very closely with folks from the medical field and public health. So in that sense, it was fascinating. My background is in systems engineering. It highlighted one more time the importance of looking at this as a system, because just trying to work on one piece doesn't help. You might know how a test works. You might have, the lab, but you need to have all the pieces. Otherwise, you just don't have testing capacity and you cannot deploy. So it once again highlighted, for me and my team, how important it is to work together across different fields and disciplines when you are facing a complex situation like this. And I guess finally, it's also being very patient sometimes. And when you are questioned, we came up with our first predictions about the disease spread in Georgia, again, taking into account people behavior. And we were hearing at the same time, this is like late April, very early in May, or, the peak is already behind us and things like that. And our models were predicting the peak is gonna be in sometime mid to late August. So you have to really kind of keep your ground and say, we have the data and the science here, and of course be open-minded, but to some degree also stick to what you know. So those are some. It was a fantastic time, and I think for the students, I'm so grateful for the fantastic team and all the work that they've done. It was a great learning experience.
Right. So you all kind of mentioned the importance of coming together, teamwork, interacting with a wide variety of people, and I think the three of you agreeing on relatively short notice to come and present at this conference is yet another example of how we as academics, scientists can come together to attack problems. So from the bottom of my heart, I thank the three of you for inspiring us and for the work you're doing in these trying times, and I wish you all the luck going forward. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's give them all a round of applause. All right, now we're going to transition to the town hall. I believe it's actually going to stay in the same Zoom channel. No change, because I see all the other conference organizers are here. So
yes.
I think, Koji, are you taking it over?
Yeah.
Okay, I will mute myself and listen.